Hi. Language is the basis of change, or more, so the mind is the basis for change for us, for our experience, because it's an interface, maybe for awareness, to relegate consciousness or regulate consciousness. And there's a difference between awareness, consciousness, self-awareness, information, knowledge, it's kind of that kind of thing. And so language is the processing of information that our mind interfaces with through the brain to control experience of reality. That means basically controls our portion of reality. And so the concept here is that the language, the pattern, the format, the definitions, the meaning regulates consciousness, or at least our perception of consciousness, our ability to realize or to know or to have control, simply. And so the basis of that is that if we don't know our language in terms of all the meanings that are, could be applied, which is kind of confusing, because then what dictates a meaning when a bunch of people use it, when it's written down, when it becomes some sort of official documentation? It's a combination of official indication or signification and the amount of collective use that occurs in a realm, reality, with populations, culture, society, and so planet. And so the idea then is that we get this type of, it's almost like an electrical circuitry, or even a virtual system, or a programmable kind of environment that exists in two forms. One's a kind of under, or like a sub-graphical layer, which is just information. It's pure information. The way you express that, the numbers, the hierarchy of the code, that's the information as it exists without any other processing. And so then, say there's an information layer that is dedicated to graphical interpretation there, or there's a secondary system at that point removed from that information, from that server, from that hard drive or something, and it is used to process the information in a way that results in graphical interpretation. Then you have a virtual environment, you have a manifested form. And so the brain is kind of like the graphical interface chip, and the monitor, the graphical card, and then the monitor. It's the processing capacity in the hardware, and to convert and create the translations, or basically the translation necessary for a graphical representation. And then you have the hardware, the monitor, which can literally display it in a pretty much a different realm, a different dimension. It's, what's the difference between magnetic code, ones and zeros, or even just numbers as abstract measurements, and a moving image on the screen, a movie of somebody you like to watch on YouTube or something like that? What's the difference? There's two different domains, basically two different universes, or two different layers of a larger universe. And so we have the same thing occurring with our body and our mind. And the idea between, or what I want to present there, is the ease of understanding the situation in comparison to technology that we have and often use every day. And so the idea here, though, is not just the basis for the the hardware software interface and the complexity behind that, which isn't very complex at all. But it's when you move up from that layer, which that was the 90s or really it was like the 40s, but that was 80s and 90s when monitors, LCD screens, all that stuff began to come out and began to improve. And so that was actually a long time ago, but that's when it's public. And so now it's at another level. You have video game consoles that are linked together, and they're using powerful computing systems connected to a server system, a community server system. So now you have moving images synchronized together on thousands of screens simultaneously, usually about hundreds or so for each game. When you get up into the thousands, then you need more computing power and things like that. But we have that, but it's just not going to be used for a video game that is in the public domain. And so, for instance, everybody on social media can be processed by tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of calculations per person per second. It's a lot less computing power required. However, there's more, power and funds applied towards that than billion-dollar corporations are using for video games. And as well, if they were allowed to use billions of dollars worth of money to improve the video game, it would move too fast, and we'd have holographic systems already, which is private sector. Anyway, the idea is that from that kind of standalone layer, we move into communal server systems and synchronized communal experiences with the same kind of multi-layered setup of information code being interpreted and represented in a graphical user interface, which becomes a virtual environment that a whole world of stuff can go on. And you can when you begin to copy code to code, and you get functions that enable you to do one to a few to a basic calculations, then you can combine calculations and get complicated programming. The next layer is when you then copy worlds to worlds, and you have, instead of going from a computer to a computer and seeing what this device does, what this app does, basically, you end up going to reality and these virtual environments. And the video game analogies are a very good, representation of that. So, but the idea is that, to match that allegory, each person is like their own world, and you have multiple people interacting in this environment, but we're all literally interacting through a slightly different, or sometimes very different, picture of reality. And so you have all of this being processed at the same time, but then how does it link together to have this collective reality? And so it's through the language. The language is the same with computing. To get two systems together, you have to build a third language that can link them. And so the idea behind that is not so much that it's happening, because a lot of people figure this out. How would the information be expressed and put together to create such a system if it were to be created in such an analogy? Or that doesn't really make sense, but basically you think about it enough, you're going to get the answers that I just displayed. The question here and the idea here is how. Okay, so what is the difference between somebody who understands the language that is being processed in their domain, their mind and body, and the immediate reality around them, society, their culture, their continent, their rock, whatever you want to call it, whatever scope you want to look at. And so, how does that differ between somebody who is able to understand the code, who is even aware that there is a code that is bringing about change that they experience as consciousness, as a different awareness represented in this graphical environment, and in a sense can be used to control or guide what's coming next, or be aware of what has happened or what could happen. The key is in unlocking that information, but how do you do that if it's all kept within code in its truest form? And so there's you can come up with a bunch of answers there about how you kind of are aware of this reality while also being aware of the information that's bringing about changes. Be aware of how you're processing information and interacting, even if it's not formally understood that that's a way of interacting. Your mind, your intentions, what you give awareness to is a form of, it's like you're moving the mouse around, or more so going into a text editor and editing code. And so, or the very beginning of that. because then you have to basically bridge the gap between the graphical system and the code. And your consciousness is the third script, the third code that is used to do that. And or maybe you could say the mind is in the consciousness as a result of the mind doing that, the different forms of consciousness that we could achieve, whether it's limited or very, very functional in this domain. But the main idea is that the way the system's working now, the way the code is working, remember the two contributions to what code is used. And so you have, and I kind of like just threw those two out there. The second one I said was collective use. If the majority of the people are using language in this way, well, basically that's what it means. Because again, what is the difference, or what is the regulation of numbers and shapes that we, there are abstractions of information that we denote as knowledge, we experience as knowledge, but we use informational transfer to communicate that and identify that, which isn't the transfer of the knowledge. You can't tell somebody something that they can actually see or get unless you're using a different format. When you use language, it's just a kind of a faith that they've had similar experiences. That works if you're talking about how hot a coffee is or something like that, but what if you're talking about something that's only present in that pure informational aspect, or the pure knowledge or awareness aspect from the soul level, or beyond the physical. And so then, then there are other ideas I put up as far as what signifies the commonly accepted language. Is there some formal way of, say, writing something a certain way, a specific book that everybody holds on to or is passed around, and that becomes the meaning of those abstractions for this reality, for consciousness, to then basically dictate consciousness. And so there are methods, but the main idea is that collective use and the way that the use is applied or connected to intent. And intent can almost relate to emotion, that if you have, an emotional charge with whatever you're claiming or expressing or spelling, it'll lead into giving more energy to it, or transfer energy to it. And so, but the idea is that if people don't even know the language of the subconscious, the symbolism behind dreams, behind desires, behind what happens and how that relates to a hierarchy of knowledge or fundamental information of our biology, or universal reasons of why species are here and why there's multiple layers of awareness and consciousness and information processing, and a virtual environment and a sub-layer. And if they're kind of blindly using the information to express what they believe is their knowledge, and the kicker here is that if they then solely rely on the mass collective reinforcement of that knowledge, i.e. society, which is largely not anymore people going out and talking and blending in, or mixing their information together, and then kind of having this melting pot of information where, whatever organizes and becomes most coherent and accessible becomes the norm. Largely now it's through media. There's a much smaller source that dictates the language, the meaning, what to get angry over, what to have emotion about, what organizes the hierarchy of your selfhood, your identity, and what is important, prioritized, or real, what is real in this virtual environment. If we go by society, and we understand that society is largely listening to a TV or media, and we see that that's controlled by a very, very small group of people. And if you look just informationally, nobody has to tell you a conspiracy theory about 6 families, which isn't a conspiracy. That's the non-conspiracy theory about all of this, which is that 6 powerful groups own the media. I think it was down to 6 now. I think it was actually because of a merger. It was down to 3 or something. And it used to be like 20, 30, 40, hundreds. And, so factually, either they're the most honest people in the world, or you're going to get a very limited scope. And that's secondary information. Then if you just look at the information that's being displayed, the media itself, and you go, well, they didn't talk about this, they didn't talk about that, they only talk about this, that. Okay, well, clearly that's a very limited, distorted, skewered scope of information, communication about reality, to the masses, to society. And so very clearly you can see how this can become a loose kind of, maybe not a paradigm, it's like a paradigm manifesting circuitry for the mind through that system. But the interesting part is that if you become aware of that, you can change it. And so nothing I say is confusing. If you become aware of how you think things, and things then happen because of the things that you thought, you get smarter. You gain control over your experience. You gain control over how you feel. You gain control over what you know, and largely what you know about yourself. You increase self-awareness, because even if you realize, well, I'm screwed, I'm doing all the dumb things over and over again, well, now that you know that, you're smarter than before when you didn't know that. And the issue here, I can kind of break it down, which again, nothing is complicated to break it down. We're all stupid in a state of nescience, and we're using corrupted language in an attempt to continually express and describe ourselves in relation to our reality in a larger system we call society, in a way that pretty much produces either continual suffering or a distortion of reality that reduces our ability to control what happens. It puts priorities in the wrong locations, in the wrong order. And so, but then again, it's not confusing, it's not impossible. You don't have to be somebody magical or special or a superhero to do this. Well, if you begin to break down the language that you use as you're using it, and you play this word game of deconstructing the way your mind interfaces with your brain, your consciousness, your identity in this reality, then you begin to both see more than was there before, and as well you can also see how there's manipulations that, when activated, when relied upon, results in that distortion, which is experienced as automated programs, automated responses, reactions, beliefs that are kind of like fractal, holographic even, but really don't need the word holographic in there, but it technically is because consciousness is holographic. There's fractal representations of that distorted construct that unique media circuitry interface with the masses, with society, represents or contains or began and started, or is just simply used to manipulate. That dragged on too long. So the idea is, when you break it down, you see that what we think and how we feel, what we believe we know, and what we do is actually being interfaced through that system, more or less infecting us when we're young, like a virus, like an inserted code, like a sentient system, an automated system that you could say it blinds a person, but you could also say it corrupts their ability to know the self, it corrupts their ability to remain in control. And it can be as simple, like going to a bar or something like that, or a club, unless there's a nice jazz lounge. Why do we do things like that? A lot of the stuff that goes on is harmful, it's toxic, it's corrupt. There are fights, there's lust, there's droning, repetitive music, if you call it that. And there's so many things that people really don't enjoy doing. Imagine like a 10-year-old kid at a club, at a bar, and he'd it would be annoying. It'd probably be annoying if anyone remembers that far back. Or you'd want to get in because everybody's doing it. What does that mean? We weren't born doing that, and so we do the things we do because it's conditioned within us to reflect and imitate one another, and it kind of goes back to the start of why it began, and we began imitating. But the idea is that it doesn't have to introduce something new, a control system doesn't. It only needs to make use of and manipulate the aspects that are kind of already out of our control. So the end result of generations of this is that we have a society that's almost entirely automated. Everyone does what they do to find happiness or to find relief from the reality that they experience because that's what everyone else does. So my proposal, again, very simple, and I'm making these shorter from here on out, 20 minutes in, is that I want to introduce how it's paradoxical. Truth is paradoxical to our consciousness, as it is now, our hierarchy, our priority. Nothing is what it seems. Everything's backwards. For instance, you would think if you stop using the language that the majority of people use to define themselves, to define this very advanced and powerful world, well, you're going to end up like Robin Williams from Jumanji, and you'll be so far disconnected by the time you get back that you'll basically be alien to this environment. And so the idea is that it's opposite. If you stop using the language that this society is based upon, you'll increase your intelligence because you'll realize how futile the last how many decades have been in trying to understand what you don't know and who you are and what is happening here. At the most simple point of view, answer, question, perspective, query, anyway, what is happening? What is reality? It's not definable through the use of language as we know it. It is definable to a much higher degree, though. You know, for instance, if we use the language to try and describe what's indescribable, we just kind of get blank stares unless the person has had the same experiences and they're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. There is a way to use language to the point where this can be taught, this can be understood. However, it's more so not what we think, and it's usually symbolic. The initial answer, the first break, is to witness, to play your hand in the deconstruction of reality through the self-initiated observation of the way your mind interfaces with your body, resulting in consciousness and a influencing of the automated systems of the brain. Again, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It all has to do with the thoughts you're thinking, which are like smoke coming off of a candle. They're not the source. They're just reflections. The thoughts are just the momentary wisps of remnants in this reality of something that's happening at a much deeper level. So thoughts are nothing. It's mind, it's awareness. You think things day in, day out. You thought things as a kid, you think things as a teen, as an adult. Okay, what were you aware of the whole time? You were aware of what you were feeling and what was really happening, but that's not expressed yet. That is right there, the barrier. We use language to generate our thoughts, which are momentary mentalisms, momentary glimpses of mind into this material reality to create an artifact, an abstraction that can be converted into something that it can be communally represented. But we use language. We only use language. Language is the code of the mind, or of the physical interface, the consciousness, the result of the mind. But it's a corrupted system. So it doesn't mean to not use language entirely, although those are the first two options of this type of initial view of what's really happening here, which is to practice being aware, but not using language to form thoughts, not using language to form your consciousness emissions from your system. And eventually you begin to, it's almost like it's a coating over these waves, these ripples. It's like something that shapes the pure awareness, and when you begin to allow it to reform, maybe reformat itself, because that can happen, you end up with pure awareness. And so some people it takes a lifetime, some people it takes weeks of intense shutting out of reality. Some people can just sit there and understand what it is because they've already been doing it because it's painful not to. But I want to say there, don't get like hung up on this, Zen, Samadhi type of experience that people chase to come to full awareness, to come to, you know, some type of stereotypical massive transformation of one's experience. It's as simple as there's an orchestra in the room. It can be very crappy and out of tune, or it can be a great symphony. Okay, well, make that room silent for 2 seconds, and then stretch that and stretch that and stretch that, and you end up having control of the arena. And the other aspect is to continue to allow the thoughts, the conscious expressions, the emissions, and to examine, to organize an interior understanding, a blueprint, a map, a code book of what the language, the thoughts, the beliefs, the attachments are supposed to mean, and how they relate to this reality, and how, or and whether that's distorted and doesn't actually express the basis of these thoughts, this belief, these realities, the mind, what you know without any other descriptor, or whether it works for that. Usually people will find that where we thought it works, we were literally just playing along. And if we all get in a big circle and try to narrow down exactly what's happening, exactly what we feel, exactly who we are, and exactly what we mean, it's like a game of telephone, and we realize it really doesn't add up in the end. We're just kind of pretending we all make sense to each other and to ourselves, which is why there's such a decoherence between the consciousness, the thoughts, the brain, the body, the desires of that automated system, and the mind, the soul, the memories of something beyond, and the spiritual force that drives us to experience and to know and to gain control and to be sovereign, if you will. There's such a decoherence that people are largely in suffering, and life is, in this civilized world, a continuous attempt to materialize through this system what we seek within out here in reality, happiness, which is really a scam. Not trying to seek out here, you can do that all you want, but happiness itself is an abstraction. You could be happy in any situation. Put it this way, if you don't have joy, you're only happy when your body is happy. If you have joy, you can be happy at all times. It's both a choice and that's an automation at that point. What does the automated circuitry do? What does the system do? Well, with the body, there's automations to keep energy moving, to keep materials moving so that they can be processed and this can continue. With the soul and the mind and the spirit, what does the automation do? It's pure creation. Whatever you get out of existence, whatever the most, wonderful joy is, that becomes the constant, the default, the baseline for experience. Meaning, well, to break that down just a hair, or maybe just a degree on the spectrum, is that knowledge of the self is the highest representation of achievement in existence. And so, for the body, knowledge of another and being able to nurture the self and being able to ensure your own survival is what we're basically wired to be the greatest thing that we can experience. And so those are two different realms, however, two different dimensions, two different information processing layers of this universe, or it may be a universe. And so, but the point is that they're connected because they're reflections of one another. When we know ourselves, or ourself, our spirit, and the soul more so, the memory contained is freed, liberated, returned back to the who you are. You gain the memories, you gain the abilities of your genetics that are locked away, and the spirit then can flow and do what it's supposed to do, or what it wants to do, which is create life, which means that in the more mythical understandings, one immortalizes themselves through the knowledge of the self. And so then you have the physical abstraction layer of that with the body, which is it's basically the desires, the desire to eat, to reproduce, to gain or receive validation through attention, through collective encouragement, things like that. It's in a way a larger self that's seeking to do the same thing that happens within, but out here in a collective format, and ultimately for society to know itself. So that's kind of all I want to say, and mainly that shift, mind to consciousness to thoughts, individual to others, to societies to collective, there's a hijacking of the translation layer, I can't think of the word for it, the protocol layer that enables the two systems to communicate with each other. And the layer begins in the mind, but where it's become hijacked or transcribed or manipulated is in the way we communicate to each other, to ourselves, and that society as a whole experiences itself, which is right now it's modulated through this media technologically driven control system. And so, but the idea is that by stopping all that, by stopping thinking, okay, it's paradoxical, you can increase your intelligence, at least momentarily, and you build to put it plainly, if you can freeze that, the thinking occurs at I believe alpha or beta level, all in terms of kind of logical memory recall. Well, actually, apparently communication in a way is it's weird. You're more alert at beta, but because you're more relaxed at alpha, you can actually work better. You can perform tasks better. However, especially in the height of the moment. However, the challenge is getting into a relaxed alpha state in the height of a moment, which is when your brain is activated, your senses, you're in a beta state. And so right there, though, that should tell you the whole system is requiring your input to guide the energy levels into a more appropriate interconnection to get what you want. That by default is an automated system, and you're just going to get the easiest level of energy output and complexity possible. Meaning whatever's likely to happen is going to happen, and you're not going to change it as often as you would if you were to apply yourself not only in the sense of doing whatever you're doing, but on this sub-layer understanding of the energy levels of your mind, your brain. There's two different things there. It's an interface, remember. You can alter that, and then that will make the problem easier on the other level. And so, but the idea is that when we're in the beta state, or when we're more aware, we're processing according to these learned or conditioned programs, automations. When we get more relaxed, the closer we get to the delta state, where there's basically a complete relaxation and even a paralysis of the body, a loss of sensation or connection, conscious awareness of your perceptions of your body, your perceptual senses, the closer you get into that dreaming, and then it's actually below dreaming, is beyond, the thinner the barrier between your conscious application of change and what we call the unconscious mind, which is just a series of fundamental or default programs that assists the process of bringing together that virtually manifested environment, your consciousness, out of what it must be a plethora of universal information that would be very, very difficult to drive a car and have a conversation with somebody about, the dynamics of basically what would be quantum physics and like rows of calculations of numbers that your brain is doing right now, and still be who you are today, which is a kind of iconography, an image of all the experiences and decisions you've ever made. So we have an abstraction. Could be an obstruction, but not quite. But that's where everything comes in, where you do away with yourself and you gain the universe, and so on and so forth. That our image of the self is part of where that system becomes entangled with false beliefs and inputted programs that are based upon either fear or it's all based upon fear. But it gets represented in different disguises. When people go out and they want to fit in, or they want acceptance and love, they want to be loved, or they want to love others, well, that's really the fear of not being loved, the fear of not having anyone to love, expressing itself in a way that those desires are then driving the person to interact, to make exchanges of belief, to act on belief, that they didn't have before. People didn't just go out and do that stuff until all the commercials, the media, and this beast-like system of automation in society connected to commerce and like a corporatization of our biology really became prominent. And even then you could say it started, you know, with the beginning of civilization, some type of manipulation that happened with some advanced civilization of potentially people that stayed over in the woods or something and just kept to themselves and learned how to control the mind before everyone else even knew what mind was. Or maybe there was advanced technology involved, transferring information back and forth. And so we get manipulated through that. I lost my place. When you, all right, let me. So it was about the. I got distracted at the beta consciousness. All the, how the interface of the different levels. Okay, fuck. So I lost my place, but I had to look. I had to go back and look. So people are chasing this happiness through these systems that are presented, which are basically conditioned into consciousness through abstractions. It's almost like a play. Like we watch plays everywhere we go. We watch shows, and we absorb it. It's like a child, how a child learns by imitating. So, and then the application of language, information to knowledge, experience to identity and self is corrupted. If you can see everything at once, say you could, or more than where you're at once, you know, a couple of moments tied together, you can see how there's a discrepancy. It's kind of like translating a specific text exactly like that, into every language and tracing the meanings back through time, through etymology, and you understand what it really means that we're using these forms of the meaning today compared to what it was long ago when things were different. And so the hint, the idea of, you know, looking into that is through the understanding of how the brain works with different levels of energy. It's just about energy. It's like a dial. And that with the beta level, where we're basically, when you're in class and you kind of don't want to be there, but you're awake because you have to be, and you might have drank coffee and ate some food, or been terribly tired in the morning, but then you showered and got to where you need to be, and now you're like beginning to become awake. It's really after you begin to become awake, because you're still in alpha. When you begin to become awake, because if somebody's talking to you and you're tired in class, the teacher or something, and you can literally just go like that and fall asleep, that's alpha. And so it's actually borderline between below alpha. Anyway, so when you are awake, and you are basically, when you're uncomfortably awake, that was actually how it was explained in one situation. When you're awake enough to have anxiety, that's your beta state, which is it's not the best state to be in, but that's our default. It's almost like you have to force the communication between the two levels at a third system, third language, which is so poor at connecting the two that there's always some programs that don't line up properly, don't synchronize properly, and functions are lost. Which is the strangest thing. It's because, again, paradoxical. Everything's paradoxical. It's like saying you work best when you're asleep. How does that make sense? You know, knowledge is most accessible to you when you're unconscious, physically. It's strange, it's paradox. But it's really not. It's just a corruption of the system that we're using. That you could say, while we're awake, we're most asleep. We're the least aware of what's going on around us. Because of how we function in this system, because of how we function mentally, because we're basically the mind in these bodies, and how these bodies relate to this environment, and what's been done here to manipulate everything. Or simply to manipulate the core code that we use to run the programs we call reality. Or the program. And so the idea is then, while you're in beta consciousness, and you're creating a self-induced feedback loop of awareness, or basically, if you can get it, consciousness, which would be like talking to yourself instead of feeling yourself, then you can discover or indicate. I can't think of the word. You can infer. You can define. Identify. Excuse me. You could identify, which is also a bad word because it kind of means share the self. But you can see what level you're at. Which again, if you simply come to a calm, but not so calm, you're relaxed, and semi-anxious state of awareness, that's better. And when you're in that, you can, it's almost like using yourself as bait. You can release those thought emissions, that train of thought, that linear production of conceptualization that is often connected to language or is directly connected to language, and you can use that to deconstruct what is or isn't happening based upon the information, not the senses, not what you see and feel through your body, but what you're cognizing, what you're conscious of through your brain mind, and what you're feeling ultimately through your mind. You'll realize there's multiple layers of experience that are occurring simultaneously. There's feeling, there's perceptions that are connected to the body, there's thinking, there's some type of sense shared between the heart and the mind and something higher, there's information processing, there's memory, there's knowledge, and there's pseudo-identity and some type of pure awareness which never leaves. Never has, never can, never will. But we experience changes all throughout the time. So what are the changes? That's another layer that's expressing these changes. That's secondary. You could even say subservient, or it's below the layer, or in this way above. It's kind of extrapolated out into this kind of this show. And there's a layer that never changes, and that's the actual awareness of the body and the mind, or more so the mind put together. Maybe not put together, it's getting confusing there. The idea is, allow the beta level consciousness emissions to display themselves, run a diagnostics on your mind, and you'll realize what's wrong. Literally like a computer system, or like the ECU computers that they plug into the car and read out the codes and then say this is what's pinging off. Excuse me. And then now you have the idea, the goal of moving through the levels of consciousness. There's gamma above beta, however, that heats the brain up, and it's not very good for human neural networks unless you basically can channel energy through those pseudoscience Chinese meridians and balance it. Otherwise, you're going to heat up and end up getting a headache, at the very least, or just tired. Or you'll think so much that you forget, unless you have like a recorder right there ready to write it all down or something. And so the idea then is, while also observing, examining the use of language, the meaning, the true meaning, the hierarchy that's being denoted, indicated, or reflected through your experience in this 1 or 2 or 3 connected moments of cognization in your own mind, while doing that, change the levels of awareness to the point where you're either being more anxiously driven towards consciousness, towards more accelerated consciousness, or relaxing down and allowing the process to not wind down, because it doesn't really match up correctly, allowing the process to fulfill itself in a way that pretty much, it's as if the brain waves have these peaks, which is exactly actually how it is. And there's each peak represents the height of accelerated activity, to the point where you're keeping the information flowing, but it's reducing the shape, the expression of that in this cognizant form, and as if the peaks are slowing down and smoothing out, and you're getting this calm equilibrium of a very consistent awareness, which is not yet produced, manufactured into what we consider language, or a cognizant form that we can identify with and say, this happened to me here at this time, in this reality, in this way. In other words, if your brain is just here to describe that in the physical sense, what does it describe if nothing is happening, and that is exactly what you're focusing on with all of your intentions? That's where you begin to move into other states, and you see how dreaming kind of mixes with you move closer to the border of dreaming, and you realize that there's a transition that occurs between the information that you use to represent yourself and some deeper sense of awareness, which it's an identity without an identity. It goes beyond what we use to identify ourselves in this world. And eventually, the more you learn about why you are the way you are, the more memories you gain through looking within, by tracing the code through the spectrum of interactions and understanding why that thought represents what that thought represents and why this hierarchy of repetition occurs. The more you do that and the more you know yourself, the more freedom you will gain over everything, over why you feel the way you do, over who controls who, over what's really going on, and the knowledge of what's happening here. Because again, if it's knowledge of what's happening here and it's based upon knowledge of the self, then you know it. It's not something you learn. It's something that you know within you, and you have to uncover that knowledge. In other ways to say, you have to unlearn what's been covering it up, or we have to remove the stupid that we've been introduced to and has been more or less running our internal lives through these external means of control and belief and temptation and collective imitation, apparently for as long as we can remember. But you can see where that control is. Reality is a map. You can see everything. Your mind is a map. The interactions between your brain, your body, and your mind is a map. You can see everything traces back to memories or causal introductions that initiate change in a certain way, a certain trend of information processing for a person's life. And so you see the root, the seed, and now we have the flowers, and the root and seed in the past, now we have the flowers in the present. Or you could even say we have the branches in the present and the flowers in the future that haven't occurred yet. And so, yeah. I have to cough really bad. That was nasty. And so, if you begin to undo that, you gain a sense of self, of control, which cannot be generated through any type of physical, purely chemical interaction. Only through the incorporation of your mind as the core of why, what, who, and how you know what you're experiencing to gain that. If it's just literally like a shape about being in the center, seeing what's happening, and knowing that the center is you, and you are the reason why this is happening because you choose to. When you're outside the center, it's as if, and technically there are some energy system where we're really at in some other virtual environment or higher dimensional environment, and it's as if the two ends of a lattice of information become off center and you get this distorted display. When it's back in the center and something happens, you react, you experience something, you feel a certain way, whatever it is, and if it's off center and you don't know why that's actually happening, it doesn't matter if you tell yourself, unless you know you're telling yourself just to get over the fact that you don't know. Because you can kind of trick the system and just, if you believe enough, you can go through it. It has to be from the heart. Because it'll make it so. Because how hard is it then for the heart that controls how you feel to make it so that you are liberated and free if your intentions are purely for that and the only thing in the way is the mind? Well, eventually the mind puts up these dams, these barriers, this drywall of resistance, and it just crumbles and goes through if your heart is strong. It's, it's natural. But the idea, or eventually the information finds its way to you through the mind because that's what the heart desired, if you will. And it has to happen. It's the true center of experience. And so, in other words, if your self is centered through your heart, and through that you understand the mind, or you connect and check the mind, then and the mind bows to the heart, the hierarchy of reality is then it's encouraging of more self-awareness, of more of the same. If it's out of alignment, kind of like the geometric talks I gave a year and a half ago or so, kind of like a mandala or something, and it's out of alignment, then what happens on the outside is not going to be accurately described in the inside, or if it is, it's a misalignment and it doesn't reflect the whole of the image, the center pattern that emanates the whole, and in that sense the self is lost. It's just the identity isn't coming through and the person is kind of lost. They're unaware, they're blind, they're being entangled by the system in ways that don't reflect who they really are. Because it's just about identity at that point, or persona, or the image of who we are, which is a reflection, an abstraction. Everything that happens to the body is a representation of soul information, of the choices that you've made, and those choices describe who you are. Not what happened to your body, but the cause, the choice you made within. That's who you really are. And so by looking at all of that, you gain the opportunity to know what happened, because it has to be some type of remembrance, recollection process, and pulling the pieces back together. And if you accept the truth that you're shown by your heart and through the mind, and then you accept self-responsibility, accountability, and you make your choice from there to remain in control, to not distort the information and accept a easier to cope with distorted version that everybody imitates, then it's like throwing chains off of your soul and your mind and your heart, and the spectrum of information that is enabled through your system at that point is like a complete other universe being opened up to you. So it's like a collective online community multiplayer game, which somebody uploaded an injection and took control of the administrative, or the engineering programmer, security access, and has basically activated cheat codes for themselves, which are not in the form of specific cheats for the person, but a wide layer distortion for everyone, a corruption of everyone's hard drive, if you will. So in that sense, they have the antidote. All they did is release a virus of ignorance, and they have the antidote. It's not like so it's weird. It's like cheat codes, but in the same sense, you could say, well, everyone can have the antidote if they so choose. But the idea is then, by isolating your character and isolating the amount of information that's being traded between the server and your character, and then observing that, you can begin to alter your own character's relationship to the game. You can, if I knew more about the coding for games, I'd be able to describe, because I'm sure this is how you can kind of take one body of knowledge and combine them, and they mix. I'm sure there are constant transfers of information between your character and a base code, and then the community, to upgrade your HP, your movement, all this stuff. There's this language. To isolate yourself, you can become aware of that language, and you can minimize the amount of control the server has using that base code over your experience in the game. And it's not even about breaking the bounds of anything. It's simply about it programs an experience for you, and then everything that it programs is what happens. And there's no user control. There's no true user control. So that's the whole idea, or part of it, of gaining user control over your character in this environment, which is organized through this type of emotional belief thought hierarchy, which is based upon language and intent. And to do this by breaking down, understanding, stopping, and then breaking down, understanding language, and tracing the meaning back to how that influences us in terms of the choices that we make and what we believe about ourselves in this reality, which is our identity, which is our self. And that in doing that, we can more or less deconstruct this system-wide corruption that's been used to basically make everybody do the same thing. Everybody looks the same in the sense of how they treat themselves, what they do, where they're chasing their happiness. Alright, well, fast forward that 1 billion years. Alright, everybody's literally a cardboard cutout of the exact same type of person, and that's it, they're robots. So that's what it seeks to do, if you will, in the high end of extrapolation. And the other end of that is when the person completely, maybe not disconnects, but is completely free from the input, the impulse, the restriction, experience restriction of that baseline code, or that the corruption of it upon their reality. And the idea with that is that we have memory, basically distortion and wiping and alteration. It's automatic. It's like it's programmed into warped memory, or the fact that memory is just a reflection of what we think happened. And they're really not because our memories suck, because nothing actually happened. We're in a continuum of now, and the past is back printed or backloaded in continually, infinitely. We're just in and out anyway. And then there's intelligence levels distortions, which are usually tied to traumatic emotional entanglements that stop us from accessing certain files or experiences about certain aspects of our existence, which take away our ability to make self-responsible decisions or choices about how we will interact with this world and ourselves, i.e. people become depressed or emotionally drained, and then they feel the need to chase happiness or realize there's something missing and then feed that, fulfill that in ways that are not congruent with a wholly beneficial outcome. You can drink something or smoke something or do something, and okay, there's happiness for a minute, a day, a year, whatever, and it's one layer of happiness to your being. Your spirit still knows there's something missing, so that whole level is through not actually doing that, not actually seeking out here. It's through knowing what's happening and seeing that within. And basically that's the idea. But see the allegories I used with the comparisons to the computer systems, the gaming systems, the virtual reality, the servers, the way computers communicate across the internet, the way collective environments work, and the amount of information transfer that is required for that, and the third languages that are required to connect two languages of different systems together. I can't remember what that's called. I think it's bootstrapping. I'm not sure. We're in a system that's highly reflective of all of those dynamics, and it's only logical that being in a form that enables, in an environment that enables such an extensive use of technology, would lead us to those similar conclusions, that we're in a situation that's constructed in some similar way, whether it's some cosmic being and system, or we're in some Atari that got advanced back in the 70s and so on and so forth. Try and record your thoughts to a collective media, and you'll see how quickly what I've said presents itself to you directly with the distortion of language and so on and so forth. If we were computers, it would be very easy. Just press play, record, etc., so on and so forth. So, in conclusion, one more thing I wanted to say or bring back up, which is that the ability to extrapolate whatever the scenario is today, whatever it looks like, whatever that trend appears to be, to the max it could ever possibly be, and the camera's still lopsided, and see where it could be, where it would appear to be in a billion years. And so right now there's a balance between free will, in the sense of simply being who we are without manipulation or a context of the masses being involved, and this system, or being involved in that, excuse me, and what's actually happening. And so you could end up with two versions. One that's entirely robotic, and it's literally like you take a drive and you put it in the back of the neck, and now that's their consciousness in this completely programmed version. Or you have a living, truly living, purely free will version, which can't even be rendered in a system like what we have today, which just look dazzling or some stuff like that. And so, again, if you know how the secret of numbers, okay, so that's the highest 9 that can't actually be formatted in this universe. But that means that outside, that's all that exists. God level or demigod level consciousness experiences that are described as entire nations or realities down here, and at that level, that's when you're switching server systems from server to server, and it's not a different day a different idea, a different identity, a different person or culture. It's entirely different universes. And we're in a universe that has been used for two beings, two God forms to interact through. It's kind of like an ultimate community multiplayer game, but it also resulted in clashes of a cosmic level. I'm going to leave it with that. Hope you enjoyed it. I forgot twice, but I guess it still showed up, so thank you. And there's something that came to me while I was transferring the footage, which is that a distortion of our will upon ourselves or our experience in reality is ultimately based upon offering, giving our allegiance, our support, our life force to animate concepts or groups or forms of identity that do not truly serve ourselves, our true self in mind or body. Something to think about. I don't know why I do this. So ultimately, we're all lying to ourselves. It's about lying to ourselves. If we're in a form of suffering, it's because we're lying to ourselves about who we are, maybe even what we are, or how we feel. That's basically it. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Which is two ways. It's easy to fix. It's also easy to corrupt if we're willing to accept the comfortable lies or even glamorous dispositions of what is inherently abstract and neither glamorous or ugly or, whatever we want to measure it as. It's when we attempt to define the indefinable, the undefinable, indescribable with predetermined notions of value or worth in this world of comparison, of relativity, and it's when we lose control over that it becomes a cage, a prison for our mind and really our energy. There's no change. There's nothing there. It's informational. It's an informational hierarchy that disables our ability to know the self, to see the self, and thus to avoid self-harm in the energetic, mental, and emotional domain. So, it's very interesting. That should provoke ideas about, notions about what's happening here. This cosmic self-dishonesty, this illusion, the false reality we create through reconstructed, distorted memory and false identities of what is the word? For like iconographic group identities, not groupthink, but basically social constructs. But that's made to use. I'm in a social construct. It means I don't like what person is ruling over us through proxy by the secret groups this few years. When have you ever enjoyed being ruled over? Now, social construct, if you're awake from that, it means you accept the bullshit. Everything's reversed. But one way to put that is social construct. It's really not. It's social collective egregores. When we identify with an egregore that was created to siphon the energy from us, we lose a piece of ourself every moment that we're filtering our experience, our awareness through a basically a pseudo-consciousness or a persona, an ego. But it's one that's constructed for the purpose of controlling your mind, which is about dishonesty or deception or illusion. And it bends what's already there. It's not purely a reconstruction or a construction. It's manipulation of what's been there. So it means there's slack, there's vulnerabilities, exploits within the way we perceive reality, within the way we identify perception as knowledge, and by reducing the slack, reducing the exploits or patching them, if you will, or actively devoting a team of programmers or security analysts to watch the information that is flowing through your building and identifying when there's an exploit being used, or applied to devote some of your mind towards that, or all of it for a particular period, maybe not doing it 99% of the time throughout the entirety of your life, but 99% of the time for a day or two, and you understand something, or of an hour, a minute, a dream, and you can alter the way the system works, basically through these basic input-output stimulus-response programs that are automated by default to serve fear and desire without true self-conscious interaction, which is basically when pure awareness can communicate to the brain, the body, the consciousness in a way that is not inhibited by this metaphysical control system, which means everything is accessible. Everything you can imagine is accessible. Doesn't mean you break the game board in half and kick it down the street. It means you can, the way the game is played, it's as if everything is accessible to you. Alright, thank you. And so it means the feeling. The game board is played through feeling, knowing the self. It means yourself is accessible to you. Your feeling is accessible to you. You're not inhibited from being who you are. And in experiencing that, through being a child, the joy of existence is happiness in itself. It's not something you get after the fact. It's not a response or a chemical automation, a reaction. So it's like being for the first time. It's like existing purely. And I can go on from there about the complications of what has to be undone and what happened to cause it and so on and so forth. Even what's being done right now, but that's the idea. It's so simple. It's about honesty and awakening to who you are for the first time here and now. And in that being in control of how you feel, and in that control of how you feel, knowing who you are, which is an indescribable, invaluable benefit to the whole of everything that you can relate to and are consciousness of and experience and feel and are aware of. It's the reason, the pinnacle, and in a conclusively abstract representation of this information, maybe this knowledge, it's as if the 2 points of this spectrum of entanglement become symmetrical and aligned, and there's a perfect equilibrium of communication from one end of it to the other, and it all becomes one congruent, unified system, as if it begins now to breathe and expand and grow and know, or even contract and balance, and it becomes harmonized. As if we're, really some web of energy with different angles and alignments that are reflective of experiences and beliefs and hierarchies and, all of that. Alright, thank you. I need to stop doing this. It's fear that stops us from accepting, from knowing, from trusting. It's fear that is used to manipulate people into accepting, knowing, trusting the illusion, the lie, the deception. It's fear. Fear is the boundary. True joy of self-knowledge is the pathway through the boundary, beyond the construct. I think that'll be it. I don't know. This is going to be a pain to edit. So that is why when we overcome that through knowledge, through a rejection of the illusion, we lose fear. We gain the ultimate compassion, the ultimate joy in all things. We gain the self. What's the difference between not self and self? An infinite amount. There is no measure of the difference. It's like the difference between light and dark. You can show a difference between 0 and some amount, or some amount and some higher amount. There's no verifiable way of describing the difference between being and having, or not being and not having. It's all difference in one notion. And so, but in that unlocking of this map of who you are through the keys that you decode or you develop through the decoding of the map, the blueprint in your mind, you gain the universe. But the idea is that you become fearless. You don't fear what can't be understood. And so that's why the knowledge of the self frees man or woman, maybe even child in certain situations. They're already free for the most part, which is strange. Again, look at that. The children have the power of freedom in this place. The adults lock themselves into these little rooms in their minds. So everything is kind of upside down like that. And once you think about it, you'll realize it. Oh, that's just because that's the way life is. Okay, you're so smart and advanced that life is so stupid, it literally lobotomizes you to the point where you're just afraid of everything and you don't know what's going on. That sounds so smart. But the kids, in their dumbass ignorance, can do anything because their minds are free. Their hearts are pure. Alright, so, and that relates to the situation with abuse and manipulation and harvesting of power, by the way. That's why it began the way it is as far as the school system and all that. You know, children are mass indoctrinated. Because if they weren't, the whole world would be different. The whole universe would be different. It would literally flow information everywhere. And so the idea, though, is that through this understanding, through an acceptance of the illusion, to understand it, deconstruct it, and break it down, just like you're allowing those thoughts, which are only remnants of true knowledge or awareness, to occur, to appear, in order to deconstruct them and trace them back to the beginning of that false knowledge, that false awakening, false cognizance. Okay, it's you know, accepting of the accepting of the what we are programmed to push away, to not know, to fear. If we dive into the unknown to know ourselves, it breaks that program, that dynamic of enslavement of the mind in any situation that it could be manifested in this universe. It frees one for all, forever. That's why one gains the capacity of spiritual flight, or their soul can traverse the dimensions now and is no longer limited by the body. That's why all these metaphors, these symbols, this ancient knowledge, that's why it's described that way. Because it's easy to draw a person turned into a bird flying into other dimensions than it is to say you have this chemical, biochemical, neurological circuitry that interacts with a one to a collective cloud neural network to form your own mind, and your consciousness is an emanation of the total, you know, sum total results of that, and then we're in this semi-virtual manifested environment that on the subquantum layer is pure information, but on a manifested level through the interpretation of the brain as a kind of standalone console, we manifest a environment that then is routed together through this collective system, which we look at as a solar system and a gene-based system, to synchronize and create this collective. Okay, nobody's going to get that in the 1800s. This is not going to make any sense. You're speaking gibberish. If you can draw a picture of it, you know, and people can get the idea of the dynamic of how that works, well, you've got the secrets without anyone really having to know it in the formal sense that we know it in modern technological terms today. And so, and as well, if you didn't have that beta consciousness corruption to get in the way, and you just had to see the image and then think and relax and go in to find the answer, you might even get it faster than we have it today, where we have all these doctrines and we have this convoluted language, basically. And so, because it's all abstract anyway. But that's the whole point. That's the freedom. That's the... You break that system and you're out of the matrix. That's the whole point. And enough people doing that to corrupt, or more so restore, this system-wide imbalance which was introduced long ago. That's the crashing of the matrix, which you can see in that simple sense has begun to happen. You know, we wouldn't be having this mind to machine to brain to audience conversation, if you will, if something drastically, you know, had not drastically changed that projection of people towards basically a robotic existence. Now, whether there's advanced technology, time travel, underground bases, cloning, interdimensional beings, parasites, so on and so forth involved. It's another video. But we know this is the blueprint of what's happening, what's been happening, and why what happens in terms of freedom, liberation, or inhibition and mind control. All right, thank you.